Hi everyone. This lecture will provide a very brief overview of prenatal development and childbirth. Some of you might be asking, why do I need to know about prenatal and brain development? I'm not studying to be a neuropsychologist or a doctor, and that is absolutely true. But some of you may want to or may end up working with pregnant women who are identified as high risk, or with teens who are pregnant and know very little about what's happening to their body and what they're responsible for doing. Or with families who need to know about prenatal development and childbirth and what to expect. So although you can't provide any medical advice whatsoever, it is helpful to have some foundational knowledge so you can support your clients through this process and serve as a resource. All right. So pregnancy is divided into 3 separate stages called trimesters, and very specific developmental events occur during each trimester. Understanding how a baby's brain develops during each stage is the first step in understanding how and why we may see developmental differences or problems in children. For example, the experience of trauma during a certain stage of pregnancy can be associated with certain delays or may place people at risk of certain mental health problems later on. We'll start with the first trimester, which occurs between fertilization to the 3rd month of development. Now, because there's so much development happening during this period and it's so quick, this stage, this trimester, is further broken into 3 different periods. In the first period, the germinal period, the egg begins to divide, and the cell material, which we know as stem cells, begins to become redistributed among several parts of the developing body. Now, the 6th day after fertilization, the egg attaches to the lining of the uterus, and now the egg is called an embryo. It is during this attachment process that there's the potential for the egg to attach to the fallopian tube or even to the intestine, which is life-threatening and will not result in a viable pregnancy. Another thing that's happening is formation of the neural tube, which begins at around 2 weeks. And this is a group of cells that will eventually form the entire brain and spinal cord through processes of repeated division. Note, though, that this is just the foundation of these brain regions. Full development of the brain doesn't actually occur until adolescence in many cases. Obviously, this is an important part of development. Okay, and there are some serious implications of trauma or drug or alcohol exposure during this stage. On the more dramatic end, a miscarriage, for example, those are very common. In the second period, the embryonic period between 3 and 8 weeks, important elements that will support the developing embryo develop even further. So, for example, the amniotic sac. The amniotic sac buffers the embryo and allows it to move around. Okay. Another thing that's developing is the placenta, which acts as an exchange station of nutrients, wastes, and, depending on the environment, potential teratogens. During the first trimester, and especially during weeks 3 to 9, the embryo is especially sensitive to damage by teratogens, which are agents that can cause malformation, such as alcohol or drugs. And the developing baby is so sensitive because there's so much development happening during this time. So if you look at the graphic on the bottom right, you can see that all of the highly sensitive periods, which are indicated by the red bars, occur between the weeks of 3 to 9. While this doesn't mean that teratogens aren't detrimental at other periods, it does mean that these areas aren't as sensitive outside of this period. And on the other hand, that they're very sensitive during this period. Beginning in the 3rd month is the fetal period, when differentiation of male and female genitalia occurs based on genetic factors and information. At this time, you can also begin to hear the developing fetus's heartbeat through the uterine wall. Next, we have the 2nd trimester, which is between 3 months and 6 months. And during this time, we have more advanced brain structures beginning to form out of the general structures that were established in the first trimester. When neurons arrive to their correct location, they make connections with other neurons, and these connections are called synapses. This process is called synaptogenesis. This will become much more important to you when you take psychopharmacology, since synapses are where many psychiatric medications have their effect. Another thing that's going on during this period is synaptic pruning, which allows for specialization. Basically, this involves removing extra connections that are not necessary. And this process continues after birth and is a product of social learning. So you use it or you lose it, right? During the 4th month, the fetus can suck and swallow, and by the end of the 6th month, the sensory receptors are well established, meaning that the developing fetus is sensitive to touch and may react to it with movement. Unfortunately, this is also the period where a lot of preterm births happen. Worldwide, about 11% of babies are born preterm. Most of these babies are born just a few weeks early, which makes their possibility of survival much higher. But a small group of these babies are born extremely preterm, meaning that they're born before 28 weeks of development. Of course, the earlier a baby is born, the more vulnerable their brain is to injury. There's risk of epilepsy, interruption of formation of the corpus callosum, hindering of the delivery of messages from one part of the brain to the other. Infants who are able to reach 25 to 27 weeks of development have a survival rate of 81%. So it is better the longer that they are developing prenatally. Next, we'll move into the 3rd trimester, which occurs from 6 months to birth. And during this stage, the brain will nearly double in size, which you can see in the little graphic on the left. By this period, sense organs have developed sufficiently to respond to perceptual stimulation. Sensory stimulation influences further development. For example, a number of studies have shown that the fetus is sensitive to auditory stimulation, including music and speech, and these babies can even recognize their mother's voice. So some implications of this suggest that there are benefits to talking to the baby in order to establish the mother-child connection, reading to the baby, and providing visual stimulation to make proper connections for sight. Another important thing that's happening during this stage is myelination. And this basically involves a brain cell wrapping the axons of neurons with a substance called myelin, which allows messages to travel down the length of the axon to neurons so that they can communicate with each other more quickly. Basically, what's happening, if you look at the graphic there, is that the myelin sheath is covering the axon, and this speeds the rate at which messages pass between the different neurons. So it makes you quicker at doing things. Okay? And this myelination continues to happen even in adulthood. Now, interruptions to this process of myelination have been shown to be associated with difficulty focusing in school and difficulty learning certain subjects. One thing that I thought was interesting about this is knowing this and knowing that it could be something that's happening during prenatal development that parents probably have no control over could help to reduce some of the blame that parents may feel if their children have ADHD, for example, knowing that it really is not their fault. Okay. And so then we have the birth of the infant, and your book goes into more about what that experience is like. And of course, there are unique needs and developments happening with infants during what is called the 4th trimester after birth. I actually want to shift focus here a bit to mothers for a bit. Okay, so after birth, all of the close and regular attention and support that mothers have been given during pregnancy shifts toward the newborn child. So for example, whereas the baby will be seen within 1 week of birth by a doctor, a mother's first and only postpartum visit happens at 6 weeks. So there is really very little follow through medically or psychologically, if at all, with the mother after the baby has been born. Okay. And though this is understandable since the child is essentially helpless and needs care, it can have profound effects on mother's postpartum healing and adjustment to motherhood. Physically, a mother may be dealing with tearing caused by vaginal birth, with surgical incision healing after a cesarean delivery, with pain and discomfort in the abdomen in either case, and potentially with hemorrhoids, which are fairly common. Even in a childbirth with 0 complications, a mother will still be dealing with postpartum bleeding for several weeks, right? And so that's just the physical. Now, if a mother chooses to breastfeed, this too may be met with a whole host of challenges that may be physical, emotional, and psychological. In these cases, we would want to be able to be there to provide lactation resources for our mother clients and to normalize the struggle that they're experiencing. Then for mothers who want to breastfeed but are unable to do so, we really may need to step in to support them as well. They may be feeling guilt or shame for not being able to breastfeed, or they may feel grief over not being able to have that experience with their newborn baby. Mentally and emotionally, mothers are also having to cope with overwhelming emotions and reduced support, coupled with very reduced sleep. Okay. And finally, it's important to consider cultural expectations for motherhood, which are described really nicely in your book, and I encourage you to take a look at those. So all of this to say, these are extremely challenging, yet often ignored months for mothers. And this is also where we really need to be aware of these issues and come in as a support. First off, it's really important that we screen for postpartum mental health issues like postpartum depression, OCD, or anxiety. And you can see some ratings, or not ratings, some prevalences of those in the infographic on the right. We can also be proactive in helping mothers and families to mobilize their supports in advance through things like organizing a food train or setting up help with household chores or having someone come in and help care for the other children. And these supports, if in place before pregnancy, should continue, hopefully, after baby is born so that mom, dad, whomever is taking care of the baby has the support that they need in order to be successful. Okay. So that's it for prenatal development and childbirth. In the next lecture, we'll go over some psychosocial issues to consider during these periods. But again, I went through these really quickly. Your book goes into much more depth. I just tried to pull out the parts that I thought were the most important. So I'll be interested in talking more about this in class with you. Let me know if you have questions. Thanks.